The groan of the stagecoach's axles was the sound of a dream dying. Jedediah Stone felt it in the pit of his stomach, a cold, hard knot that tightened with every squeal of the straining wood and leather. He stood on the warped planks of the boardwalk, the Montana sun beating down on the back of his neck, his best shirt sticking to his skin. His hand, calloused and scarred from a life of ranch work, instinctively went to the folded letter in his pocket. For months, that letter and the dozen that followed had been a flickering candle in the vast, lonely darkness of his life. A promise of companionship, of a voice to fill the silence of his cabin, of a partner to share the burdens and the beauty of the land he'd bled for. The town of redemption held its breath with him. Faces peered from the windows of the general store, and conversations in front of the saloon dwindled to watchful silence. They all knew. They knew lonely Jed Stone, who had lost his family to fever a decade ago and had spoken more to his horse than to people since, had sent for a mail-order bride. And, of course, Elias Thorne knew. Thorne was leaning against a porch column of the saloon he owned, a massive, imposing figure in a tailored coat that must have been hell in this heat. His face, framed by silvering sideburns, was set in a mask of smug contempt. Beside him, his two brutish ranch hands, the Calloway brothers, grinned like vultures scenting a kill. Thorne's animosity toward Jed was the stuff of local legend, a low-simmering feud over the one thing Thorne couldn't buy: Stone Creek, the artery of pure, life-giving water that ran through Jed's land and kept his modest ranch, Stone's Throw, green while Thorne's vast dominion withered in the late summer sun. Thorne saw Jed's desperate bid for happiness as another weakness to be exploited, another nail to hammer into his coffin. The stagecoach shuddered to a halt, the horses blowing and stamping in the thick dust. The driver, a weary man named Silas, grunted and set the brake. The door swung open. Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. He had memorized her photograph, a serious-looking woman with intelligent eyes and a hint of a smile. Sarah Miller. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. He would step forward, tip his hat, and see that hint of a smile blossom into a real one. A woman's boot appeared, worn but sturdy. Then a skirt of simple gray wool. Then she emerged, her hand clutching the doorframe for support. It was her. The same intelligent eyes, the same dark hair pulled back from a pale, tired face. But Jed's mind barely registered the resemblance because his entire world narrowed to a single impossible fact. Sarah Miller was pregnant. Not just a little. She was profoundly, undeniably, ready to burst pregnant. A gasp rippled through the onlookers, a collective intake of breath that was pure, unadulterated scandal. Then came the laugh. It erupted from Elias Thorne, a booming, cruel roar that echoed down the dusty street. "Well, I'll be," he bellowed, slapping his thigh as the Calloway brothers howled with glee. "Looks like Stone got more than he bargained for. A 2-for-1 deal right off the stage. Hope you paid extra for the baggage, Jed." Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced Jed through. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, their pity and scorn like physical blows. His dream didn't just die, it was paraded through the street, mocked, and left to rot in the sun. Every instinct screamed at him to turn, to mount his horse, to ride away and never look back. To deny her, deny this whole catastrophic mistake. The name Stone, his name, was being dragged through the mud, and his gut churned with a nauseating mix of anger and shame. Who was this woman? How could she have lied so completely? He looked at her. Really looked at her. She stood alone, a solitary island in a sea of judgment. Her small valise was clutched in her hand like a shield. Her face was ashen, her chin trembling, but her eyes, swimming with shame, held something else, too. A primal terror. She wasn't looking at him as a swindled husband, but as a drowning woman looking at the only piece of driftwood in a storm. She wasn't a liar in that moment. She was a victim. And in her posture, the slight instinctive way she angled herself to shield her swollen belly, he saw a fierce, desperate protectiveness. The jeers of Thorne and his men faded to a dull buzz. The staring eyes of the town blurred. All Jed could see was the raw, unvarnished fear in Sarah Miller's eyes. His loneliness, the very thing that had driven him to this, suddenly felt like a selfish indulgence compared to the abyss of desperation she was facing. Something inside him, a core of decency he'd inherited from a father, long gone, solidified. He had built his ranch, stone's throw, on a foundation of hard work and integrity. He would not let it or himself be defined by the cruelty of a man like Thorne or the judgment of a fickle town. Ignoring the snickers and the renewed wave of whispers, Jedediah Stone moved. He walked off the boardwalk, his boots sinking into the thick dust, and stopped directly in front of her. The world seemed to hold its breath again. He reached out and gently took the heavy valise from her white-knuckled grip. "I'm Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice quiet but firm enough to carry in the sudden hush. It wasn't the greeting he'd rehearsed, but it was the only one that mattered now. "Welcome, ma'am. Let's get you home." The silence on the wagon ride back to the ranch was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Jed kept his eyes fixed on his horse's ears, the rhythmic clop of hooves and the rattle of the wagon wheels doing little to fill the chasm between them. He could feel her presence beside him, radiating a brittle tension. He could feel his own heart, a dull, aching stone in his chest. Home. The word felt like a lie in his mouth. He had spent weeks preparing for her arrival. He'd scrubbed the small two-room cabin until his knuckles were raw. He'd built a new bookshelf for the books she'd mentioned loving in her letters. He'd even planted a small patch of wildflowers near the porch, a splash of color against the endless green and brown of the prairie. It was all for a ghost, for a woman who didn't exist. His mind replayed her letters, searching for the deceit he'd missed. Her words had been a balm to his soul. She wrote of teaching children in a small Pennsylvania town, of her love for poetry, of her desire for a life of purpose and partnership. There had been no hint of this. No mention of a man, of a love affair, of a child. He felt a fresh stab of anger, the bitter sting of a fool's hope. He risked a sideways glance. She was staring at her hands, which were twisted together in the lap of her gray dress. Tears were tracking silently through the dust on her cheeks, leaving clean, glistening trails. She wasn't the duplicitous schemer Thorne's laughter had painted her as. She was just broken. Finally, a choked sob escaped her, and the dam broke. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words ragged. "I never meant to deceive you. I didn't know what else to do." Jed remained silent, his jaw tight. He kept driving. "His name was Arthur," she began, her voice gaining a little strength, as if speaking the truth, no matter how painful, was a relief. "He was a traveling merchant. He was charming. He said all the things a woman who has spent her life in a small town dreams of hearing. He spoke of cities, of adventures, of a life beyond anything I'd ever known." She took a shuddering breath. "He promised me marriage. We were to be wed in the spring. When I told him about the baby, he was pleased. Or he pretended to be. He said he had to go on one last trip to settle his affairs, that he would send for me in a month. He never came back. He took all my savings, every last penny I had set aside. I was ruined. My family, they are good, devout people. The shame would have destroyed them. I would have been cast out." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes pleading. "Answering your advertisement was my last resort. My only hope. I was going to tell you, I swear I was. I prayed that once I was here, once you met me, you might find it in your heart to understand. I was a fool, a desperate, foolish woman." She trailed off, her voice thick with self-loathing. "I will not be a burden to you. Take me to the next town, leave me on the road, whatever you want. I won't trouble you again." Jed listened, the hard knot in his stomach slowly uncoiling, replaced by a weary, aching compassion. The anger at her deception was still there, a hot coal in his gut, but it was now overshadowed by a colder, more righteous fury at the man named Arthur, a faceless grifter who had destroyed her life and, in the process, had nearly destroyed Jed's hope. He thought of Thorne's gloating face. He thought of the town's scorn. Leaving her on the road wasn't an option. She wouldn't survive a day. And even if she did, the scandal would cling to him like tar. A weapon Thorne would use to hound him relentlessly. He had wanted a partner, a companion. Instead, he'd been handed a crisis, a woman and an unborn child whose fates were now inextricably tied to his. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard of his ranch. Stone's Throw. It was a simple, sturdy place. A small, well-built cabin, a solid barn, and corrals that were in good repair. His life's work. It looked small and vulnerable under the vast Montana sky. His only hired hand, Creek Johnson, emerged from the barn. Creek was a gnarled, grizzled old cowboy with a face like a road map of every hard mile he'd ever traveled. He took one look at Sarah, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked at Jed, his jaw slack. He looked back at Sarah, then slowly removed his hat, a gesture of pure, dumbfounded shock. "Creek," Jed said, his voice flat. "This is Sarah Miller. She'll be staying in the spare room." He helped Sarah down from the wagon. She swayed on her feet, her face a mask of exhaustion and despair. He led her into the cabin, into the spare room he had so carefully prepared for a different woman, a different life. He left her there and closed the door, the sound echoing the final, definitive closing of a door in his own heart. That evening, the sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rose to a shriek. A storm, sudden and violent, slammed into the prairie. It was as if the turmoil at the heart of Stone's Throw had been unleashed upon the world. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the yard to a sea of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the small cabin. The creek, his creek, began to swell, its gentle murmur turning into an angry roar, cutting them off completely from the outside world. It was just after midnight when the scream came from Sarah's room. Not a scream of fear, but of pure primal pain. Jed's blood ran cold. Creek, who had been trying to sleep by the fire, shot bolt upright. Another cry tore through the night, followed by a desperate gasp. There was no doctor, no midwife, no town. There was just the raging storm, a terrified woman, and two cowboys who knew more about birthing calves than human babies. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Jed. He saw Creek's wide, helpless eyes and knew they were utterly, terrifyingly alone. He pushed open her door. Sarah was writhing on the bed, her face contorted in agony, her hands clenched in the quilt. "It's coming," she gasped, her voice strained. "The baby! It's coming now!" Necessity became a brutal master. The panic receded, replaced by a grim, focused determination. "Water, Creek. Boil it. And get every clean cloth we have," Jed commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The next few hours were a blur of raw, visceral horror and humbling awe. Guided by Sarah's desperate, gasped instructions between waves of excruciating pain, Jed did things he never imagined he would do. The cabin, filled with the sounds of the storm and Sarah's cries, became a sacred, terrifying space. Lightning flashes illuminated the scene in stark, nightmarish detail. Sarah's sweat-soaked face, Jed's hands covered in blood, Creek's pale, praying form in the corner. And then, as the storm outside began to finally exhaust itself, a new cry filled the room. Thin, wavering, but fiercely alive. Against all odds, as the first light of a new day seeped through the window, a baby girl, slick and beautiful and perfect, lay breathing in Jedediah Stone's trembling hands. The morning sun rose on a world washed clean. The air was cool and crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The only evidence of the night's fury was the sodden ground and the roaring, impassable creek. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace reigned. Sarah was asleep, her body finally succumbing to an exhaustion so profound it was close to death. In a makeshift cradle beside Jed's hearth, the baby slept, tiny and perfect. Jed sat at his small table, a cup of coffee untouched in his hands. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. He kept looking at the infant. He had spent 10 years building walls around his heart to keep the loneliness at bay. And one night, this tiny, helpless creature had breached them all. He felt a fierce, terrifying wave of protectiveness wash over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a boy watching over his little sister. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, what would happen now. If he sent Sarah on her way, he would be sentencing her and this child to a life of destitution and scorn, if not outright death. And Thorne? Thorne would never let this go. The scandal would be the perfect weapon. Jed Stone's whore and her bastard. He would use it to poison the town against him, to drive away his business, to isolate him until he had no choice but to sell, to surrender. His gaze fell upon Sarah, her face peaceful in sleep. She was strong. He had seen that strength in the night, a will of iron that had refused to break. He looked back at the baby. He had brought her into this world. His hands were the first to hold her. He was bound to her now, whether he liked it or not. Later that day, Sarah awoke. Jed was sitting by her bed, holding the baby, who was wrapped snugly in a clean blanket. He looked up as her eyes fluttered open. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "She is," Jed agreed. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft breathing of the infant. The reality of their situation settled around them, heavy and unavoidable. Finally, Jed spoke, his voice low and devoid of passion, filled instead with a grim, practical determination. "Marry me!" Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, looking her straight in the eye. "It's the only way. We go into town, we get the preacher to sign the papers. We tell everyone the baby came early. It's a lie, but it's a lie they'll have to swallow. We give her my name. My name protects her. And it protects this ranch. It protects us from Thorne." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Tears of gratitude, of despair, of 1,000 emotions she couldn't name. It wasn't a proposal of love. It was a treaty, a business arrangement born of desperation. But it was also a lifeline. It was a chance. "Why?" she whispered. "After what I did? Why would you do this?" Jed looked down at the tiny baby girl asleep in his arms. He gently stroked her cheek with his rough finger. "Because I held her when she took her first breath," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite define. "That makes her my responsibility. And you're her mother. That makes you my responsibility too." Sarah looked at this hard, quiet man who had every right to cast her out, but was instead offering her his name, his protection, his home. She looked at her daughter, a tiny, perfect symbol of a life she thought was over. For the first time in months, a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel ignited within her. Hope. She nodded, a single decisive movement. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." The marriage was a hurried, stark affair. The preacher in Redemption, a man named Reverend Michael, was a timid soul who visibly paled when Jed and Sarah appeared on his doorstep, the baby bundled in Sarah's arms. His eyes darted from Sarah's still wan face to the infant, his mind clearly doing the dubious math. "She was born prematurely," Jed stated, his voice flat and daring the preacher to argue. "The storm? There was no time to fetch a doctor." Reverend Michael stammered, wringing his hands, until Jed placed a heavy pouch of coins on his desk. The donation to the church roof fund worked wonders on the preacher's conscience. The ceremony was brief, the words spoken without sentiment, in the dusty quiet of the church office. As they signed the register, Jed glanced out the window. Across the street, Thorne stood on the saloon porch, watching, his face a thundercloud of black fury. The marriage certificate was not a declaration of love. It was a gauntlet thrown down, a public act of defiance that Thorne took as a personal insult. Jed had taken a situation meant to humiliate him and forged it into a shield. The fight was far from over. It had just been formally declared. They named the baby Hope. It was Sarah's suggestion, whispered on the wagon ride home. It felt right. She was the anchor of their strange, fragile alliance, the living, breathing reason for the bargain they had struck. Life at Stone's Throw settled into a new, awkward rhythm. The cabin, once a bastion of solitary silence, was now filled with the unfamiliar sounds of a baby's cry, a woman's soft humming, the rustle of skirts. Jed felt like a stranger in his own home. He and Sarah moved around each other with a careful, deliberate courtesy, like two skittish horses in a new corral. Their conversations were stilted, focused on practicalities. The baby's feeding, the dwindling supply of flour, the state of the fences. Yet, in the quiet moments, a different kind of language began to form between them. Jed would watch, mesmerized, as Sarah bathed Hope in a small wooden tub, her movements deft and filled with a love so fierce it was palpable. He started leaving freshly chopped wood on the porch every morning and found his mending pile, once a mountain of torn shirts and socks, mysteriously shrinking. One evening, he came in from a long day of branding to find Sarah asleep in the rocking chair, a book of poetry open in her lap, Hope sleeping soundly on her chest. He gently took the baby from her arms, his rough hands surprisingly tender, and placed her in the cradle. He then draped a blanket over Sarah's shoulders, his fingers brushing her neck for a fleeting electric moment. It was a gesture of pure, unthinking care, and it startled them both. Sarah, in turn, began to see past Jed's stoic, silent exterior. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes after a 16-hour day and the quiet pride he took in his land. She saw the way his large, clumsy hands would try to soothe Hope, his deep voice murmuring nonsense until the baby's cries subsided. He was a good man, a man of profound integrity. The respect she felt for him began to deepen into a quiet, tentative affection. This fragile domesticity, however, was a peace bought on borrowed time. Thorne was not a man to accept defeat. His rage, denied a public spectacle, festered and turned venomous. He began his squeeze, not with fists, but with the slow, crushing weight of his influence. It started at the general store. Mr. Henderson, a man from whom Jed had bought supplies on credit for years, suddenly refused him. "Sorry, Jed," he mumbled, refusing to meet Jed's eyes. "Thorne's called in my loan. All my business has to be cash up front now." Then it was the livery. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, apologetically explained he couldn't shoe Jed's horses anymore. "Thorne's men told me if I did any more work for you, they'd burn my smithy down," he whispered, his face slick with sweat and fear. Thorne's men, the Calloway brothers, became a constant, menacing presence. They would sit on their horses on the ridge overlooking Stone's Throw, just watching. It was a war of attrition designed to isolate him, to strangle his livelihood until he choked. The harassment soon escalated from economic to physical. One morning, Jed rode out to find 50 yards of his northern fence cut clean through. A dozen of his best cattle had wandered off, likely already rebranded with Thorne's mark. There was no proof, but Jed knew. A few days later, a horrifying stench led him to his well. Thorne's men had thrown a dead coyote into it, fouling his water supply. It took Jed and Creek 3 grueling days of back-breaking work to haul the carcass out and clean the well. 3 days of hauling water from the creek. 3 days of feeling Thorne's boot on their necks. "He's trying to break you, boy," Creek said, his voice grim as he wiped sweat from his brow. "He ain't gonna stop." "I'm not breaking," Jed growled, his hands raw, his patience worn to a thread. He decided he'd had enough. Leaving Creek to watch the ranch, he rode into Redemption, a cold fire burning in his belly. He strode through the swinging doors of the saloon, the lively chatter and tinny piano music dying as he entered. Thorne was at the bar, a whiskey in his hand, holding court with his cronies. He saw Jed, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Jed walked straight up to him. "Leave my ranch alone, Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously low. "This is between you and me. Leave my family out of it." Thorne let out a short, barking laugh. "Family?" he sneered, turning to the room. "You hear that, boys? He calls it a family." He turned back to Jed, his eyes glittering with malice. "You've got bigger problems than your ranch, Stone. You've got a whore for a wife and a bastard for a child. You brought shame into this valley, and I'm going to see that you pay for it." Something inside Jed, a cord of control he'd held taut for weeks, snapped. He didn't think. He just swung. His fist connected with Thorne's jaw with a satisfying crack. Thorne staggered back, shock and fury on his face. The saloon erupted. The Calloway brothers lunged at Jed, and he met them with the pent-up rage of 100 injustices. He was a capable fighter, his strength honed by years of hard labor, and he sent the younger Calloway crashing over a table. But Thorne was a brute, a bull of a man, and he charged in, his fists like sledgehammers. The fight was a blur of splintering wood, shattering glass, and grunts of pain. Jed held his own, but he was outnumbered. He was on the floor, a boot crushing his ribs, when the familiar, weary voice of Sheriff Brody cut through the chaos. "That's enough, all of you!" Brody and his deputy pulled them apart. Jed was breathing heavily, his lips split, and his eye already swelling. Thorne had a bloody nose, but was otherwise grinning in triumph. "He started it, Sheriff," Thorne said smoothly. "Walked right in here and assaulted me in my own establishment." Sheriff Brody looked from Thorne's smug face to Jed's defiant one. Jed could see the conflict in the sheriff's eyes, saw the struggle between his badge and Thorne's payroll. The payroll won. "Jed, you're under arrest," Brody sighed, pulling out his handcuffs. "Disturbing the peace." As Brody dragged him toward the door, Jed locked eyes with Thorne. The land baron's smile was one of pure sadistic victory. He had provoked Jed, beaten him, and now was having him locked away like a common criminal. The humiliation was absolute. The next morning, the door to the sheriff's office opened. Jed looked up from the hard cot in his cell, expecting Brody with a plate of stale bread. Instead, it was Sarah. She had hope bundled in a sling against her chest, and she stood with a posture that was anything but victim-like. Her face was calm, her eyes clear and resolute. She walked directly to Sheriff Brody's desk. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I believe you are holding my husband under false pretenses." Brody looked up, surprised. "Ma'am, he started a brawl in the middle of the day." "He was provoked," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse. She placed a folded piece of paper on his desk. "This is a sworn statement, which I had notarized by the clerk this morning. It details Mr. Thorne's verbal assault on my husband, in which he libeled both my character and the legitimacy of my child in front of at least a dozen witnesses." Brody stared at the paper. Sarah continued, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more pointed. "I have also taken the liberty of writing a letter to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. I have described the constant harassment my husband has endured, the destruction of his property, and the clear bias shown by the local law enforcement." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I have not mailed it yet. I thought perhaps you and I could come to an understanding, because if anything unfortunate or were to happen to my husband or my property, that letter would make you look either dangerously incompetent or actively complicit. I imagine the marshal would be very interested in which it is." It was a magnificent bluff. Jed watched, stunned, from his cell. This was not the broken woman who had cried in his wagon. This was the intelligent, articulate schoolteacher from the letters, a woman of formidable strength and strategic intellect. Sheriff Brody read the statement, his face growing paler. He looked at Sarah's unyielding expression, then at the sleeping baby, and finally at Jed. He was trapped. He let out a long, weary sigh and took the keys from his belt. "He's free to go," Brody grumbled, avoiding her eyes. He unlocked the cell door. "But you watch yourself, Stone. You stay out of trouble." Jed walked out of the cell and stood beside his wife. He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the fierce, protective way she held their child. His respect, already growing, deepened into a profound, heart-stopping admiration. She had faced down a corrupt sheriff and, by extension, Thorne himself, using nothing but her wits and her courage. On the silent wagon ride home, the space between them was no longer a chasm. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. He was the brawn, the physical protector. She was the mind, the strategist. Together, they were something more. Together, they might actually have a chance. Their quiet conversations that night were different. He found himself telling her about his parents, about the sister he'd adored, about the suffocating silence that had driven him to a matrimonial agency. She, in turn, told him more about her life, her love of teaching, the simple dreams that a scoundrel had almost stolen from her. The pretense of their marriage of convenience began to feel thin, the reality of their shared struggle and growing bond far more substantial. But Thorne's fury, thwarted in public, now curdled into something far more dangerous. If he couldn't break Jed with economics or humiliation, he would do it with blood and fire. He rode out to a desolate camp in the Badlands, a place law-abiding folk avoided. There, he met with a man known only as Black-Eyed Finn, a ruthless outlaw whose gang of rustlers and cutthroats were for hire to the highest and most discreet bidder. The deal was simple. Finn and his men would raid Stone's Throw. They would kill Jedediah Stone and his hired hand. They would make it look like a random, brutal attack by marauding bandits. Thorn would then ride in, the concerned neighbor, to discover the tragedy. He would offer his protection to the grieving widow and her helpless child, and in her gratitude and distress, she would surely sign over the deed to the ranch with the precious creek. It was a perfect, bloody plan. The attack came at dusk 2 days later. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and blood. Jed and Creek were in the barn, finishing the evening chores. Sarah was inside the cabin, humming a lullaby to hope. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, frantic whinnying of the horses. Jed and Creek exchanged a look and grabbed their rifles. Peering through a crack in the barn door, Jed's blood ran cold. A dozen riders were cresting the ridge, coming in fast, fanned out in a classic attack formation. "Inside!" Jed yelled to Creek. "Get to the cabin!" They sprinted across the yard, bullets kicking up dust around their feet. They burst through the cabin door just as the first wave of riders galloped into the yard, guns blazing. "Sarah, get down! Take Hope and get in the root cellar," Jed commanded, his mind racing. But as he and Creek took up positions at the windows, returning fire, he saw Sarah wasn't cowering. She had placed the sleeping Hope in the sturdy wooden cradle and pushed it into the safest corner of the room. Then, her face pale but her jaw set, she took Jed's spare shotgun from the wall mount. Her hands trembled as she loaded it, but her eyes were filled with a cold, hard resolve. "I don't know how to use this," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Just point it out the window and pull the trigger," Jed shouted over the roar of gunfire. The siege of Stone's Throw had begun. The cabin, their home, became a makeshift fortress. Bullets splintered the door and shattered the windows. Jed and Creek were experienced shots, and they made the bandits pay for every foot of ground. They dropped 2 riders in the first pass, but Finn and his men were professionals. They took cover behind the corral and the water trough, settling in for a protracted fight. The sun went down, plunging the yard into a terrifying darkness, lit only by sporadic muzzle flashes. The most surprising element of the fight was Sarah. She took up a position at a side window, the one that covered the barn. The kick from the shotgun nearly knocked her off her feet, but she braced herself and fired again. A cry of pain from the darkness told her she'd hit something. She was no longer just a victim to be protected. She was a defender of her home, of her child. At one point, a bandit tried to sneak up on Creek's blind side. Sarah saw him, let out a yell, and fired the shotgun. The blast, though it missed, sent the man scrambling back into the darkness, saving Creek's life. Hours crawled by. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. They were trapped. Their ammunition was running low. Finn and his men were just waiting them out. During a lull in the fighting, they heard a pained groan from near the porch. It was one of the men Jed had shot earlier, trying to crawl away. Before the man could alert the others, Creek slipped out the back door, silent as a ghost. A moment later, he was back, his face grim. "He's dead," Creek said, "but he talked before he went. Said it was Thorn. Thorn hired them to kill us all." The words hung in the air, a confirmation of their darkest suspicions. Now they had proof, but it was useless if they didn't survive the night. They were out of options. The sheriff was a lost cause. The town was too far and too intimidated. They were on their own. As they sat in the tense darkness, waiting for the final assault, Sarah's mind was racing. An old memory, a piece of useless information, suddenly clicked into place. She remembered the grifter, Arthur. He had been a braggart, especially when in his cups. He'd boasted about his previous employer, a rich and powerful rancher in Montana, who had a talent for acquiring land from stubborn neighbors. Arthur had laughed about how this rancher kept a detailed ledger of all his dirty dealings, a secret insurance policy, hidden in a clever safe right in his study. He'd even described the mechanism, a loose stone in the fireplace mantel. At the time, it had just been drunken boasting. But now, the powerful rancher, the location, the ruthless methods, it had to be Thorn. "Jed," she said, her voice urgent, "I think I know a way. A long shot, but it might be the only one we have." She quickly explained what Arthur had told her. "Thorn has a ledger, proof of everything. If you could get to it." A desperate, insane plan began to form. Jed and Creek would create a diversion, a big one. It would have to be loud and bright enough to draw the attention of Finn and all his men. In the confusion, Jed would slip out the back, saddle his fastest horse, and ride like the devil himself to Thorne's ranch. It was a suicide mission. But as Jed looked at Sarah's determined face and at the sleeping form of his daughter, Hope, he knew it was the only way. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore. He was fighting for a future he hadn't even known he wanted. The plan was born of sheer desperation. Creek, with a grim nod, began gathering kindling and a can of lamp oil. The target was the hay barn, old, dry, and situated far enough away to create a significant distraction without endangering the cabin. It would go up like a Roman candle. "Once it's lit, they'll all turn to look," Creek whispered, his voice raspy. "That's your window, Jed. Don't you waste it." Jed turned to Sarah. The air between them crackled with everything left unsaid. In the flickering lamplight, her eyes were wide with fear, but also with a fierce, unwavering trust in him. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed away a smudge of gunpowder. It was a gesture more intimate than any kiss they could have shared, a promise forged in the crucible of a shared nightmare. "I'll be back," he murmured. It wasn't just a promise to her, it was a vow to himself. He slipped out the back of the cabin as Creek crept towards the barn. From her window, Sarah watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw Creek douse the corner of the barn, then strike a match. The barn didn't just catch fire, it exploded. A whoosh of sound and a massive pillar of orange flame shot into the night sky, turning the dark yard into a hellish, dancing landscape of light and shadow. Shouts of surprise and alarm erupted from the bandits. As one, they turned their attention to the inferno, momentarily forgetting their prey. That was Jed's moment. He sprinted to the corral, his movements swift and silent. He bridled his best horse, a strong black gelding named Midnight, swung onto its bare back and urged it into a gallop, heading away from the fire, melting into the deep shadows of the prairie. The ride to Thorne's ranch was a testament to terror and resolve. Jed pushed Midnight to the limits of his endurance, his mind a maelstrom of fear for Sarah and Creek and a burning focus on the mission. He dodged the main roads, cutting across open country he knew like the back of his hand. He saw the distant silhouettes of Thorne's patrols and guided Midnight through gullies and behind rock formations, his heart pounding with every near discovery. He wasn't just a rancher anymore, he was a hunter, an infiltrator, a man pushed far beyond his limits. He arrived at the Thorne Dominion as the fire at his own ranch was becoming a dull orange glow on the horizon. Thorne's ranch house was an arrogant statement of power, a two-story monstrosity of dark timber and stone that loomed over the valley. Lights burned in the downstairs windows. Jed tethered Midnight in a copse of cottonwoods and approached on foot, a ghost in the darkness. He circled the house, his rifle held ready. A lone guard was stationed near the back, smoking a cigarette, his silhouette framed by the light from a kitchen window. Jed moved with a predator's patience. He picked up a stone and tossed it into the bushes 20 yards to the guard's left. The man stiffened, drawing his pistol. "Who's there?" he called out, moving cautiously toward the sound. As he passed a dark corner of the house, Jed struck, his rifle butt connecting with the base of the man's skull in a single, silent, disabling blow. He slipped through an unlocked window into Thorne's study. The room reeked of cigar smoke, leather, and self-importance. A massive oak desk dominated the space, and the walls were lined with books Thorne had probably never read. Jed's eyes went immediately to the huge stone fireplace. His heart hammered as he ran his hands along the mantel, just as Sarah had described. His fingers found it. A stone that was slightly loose. He pressed. With a soft click, a section of the wall beside the fireplace swung inward, revealing a heavy iron safe. He didn't have the combination, but he had a rancher's ingenuity and a crowbar he'd grabbed from the woodshed. For 10 agonizing minutes, he worked on the safe's hinges, the screech of protesting metal sounding like a cannon blast in the silent house. Finally, with a groan of tortured steel, the door gave way, and there it was. A thick, leather-bound ledger. Jed's hands trembled as he opened it. His lantern cast a pool of light on the neat, spidery script. It was all there. Every dirty secret, every criminal act. payments to Black-Eyed Finn for pest removal, meticulous notes on how Thorne had swindled a dozen smaller ranchers out of their land through fraudulent debts and intimidation. There were even copies of letters, damning evidence of a systematic campaign of terror that had made Thorne king of the valley. This ledger wouldn't just save Stone's throw, it would burn Thorne's empire to the ground. He grabbed the ledger and the letters, his heart soaring with a wild, triumphant hope. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the sky, Jed raced back towards his home. The smoke was thicker now, a grim plume against the rising sun. Fear gnawed at him. Had he been too late? Back at Stone's Throw, the situation was desperate. The fire had been a brilliant diversion, but it was dying now. Finn and his men, realizing they'd been tricked, were enraged. They launched their final assault. Sarah and Creek were down to their last few rounds of ammunition. The cabin door was splintering under the onslaught. It was only a matter of time. Sarah fired the shotgun one last time, the blast a hollow boom of defiance. "That's the last of it," Creek grunted from the other window, his rifle now empty. They braced themselves for the end, and then they heard it. Not gunfire, but the thunder of hooves. A lot of hooves. Finn and his men heard it too, turning from the cabin in confusion. Over the ridge, silhouetted against the dawn, appeared a line of riders. At their head was Jedediah Stone, the stolen ledger held aloft like a battle standard. And he was not alone. On his ride back, Jed hadn't come straight home. He had ridden to the small, hard-scrabble ranches of the very men whose names he'd seen in Thorne's ledger. The Garcias, the O'Malleys, Old Man Peterson. He had woken them up, shoved the proof of Thorne's treachery in their faces, and given them a choice. Continue to live under Thorne's boot, or ride with him and take their justice. Looking at the evidence of their ruin, their simmering resentment had boiled over into righteous fury. It was a small posse, a ragtag collection of wronged men, but they were armed, and they were riding for vengeance. They crashed into the flank of Finn's gang like an avenging fury. The battle was no longer a siege, it was a swirling, chaotic melee. Jed's allies, fighting with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, tore into the bandits with a vengeance. Creek, letting out a wild yell, grabbed a fallen outlaw's pistol and rejoined the fight from the cabin porch. Jed had eyes for only one man. He saw Thorne, who had ridden out from his own ranch to oversee the final victory, his face a mask of disbelief and fury as he watched his plan disintegrate. The chaos of the gunfight seemed to fade into the background as their eyes locked across the battlefield. This was never just about land, it was personal. With a roar of pure rage, Jed spurred Midnight forward. Thorne, accepting the challenge, charged to meet him. They collided near the smoldering remains of the barn, their personal war finally coming to a head. It wasn't a clean, heroic duel of the sort written about in dime novels. It was a desperate, ugly brawl. They were both unhorsed, tumbling into the muddy, ash-strewn yard. They came up swinging, two bulls locking horns. Thorne had size and brute strength, but Jed had the fire of a man defending everything he held dear. He fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, fueled by the image of Sarah and Hope inside the cabin. The fight was a grueling exchange of brutal punches and desperate grappling. Thorne drew a knife, its blade glinting in the morning sun. He lunged, but Jed, anticipating the move, caught his wrist. They struggled for the weapon, their grunts of effort raw and animalistic. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Jed twisted Thorne's arm, sending the knife flying. He landed a solid right hook that sent Thorne staggering back and followed it with another that dropped the land baron to his knees. Jed stood over him, chest heaving, his fist raised to deliver the final blow. It was then that a new group of riders appeared. At their head was Sheriff Brody, but beside him rode a stern-faced man with a U.S. Marshal's star pinned to his vest. One of the ranchers Jed had recruited had had the foresight to ride straight for town and send a telegraph to Helena. The fight was over. Finn's gang was scattered, either dead, wounded, or captured by the vengeful ranchers. A defeated and mud-spattered Elias Thorne was hauled to his feet and placed in irons by the marshal, the ledger serving as the irrefutable nail in his coffin. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, Sheriff Brody became a model of officious law enforcement, his earlier corruption conveniently forgotten. Thorne, a pathetic shadow of his former self, was led away, shouting threats and curses that no one feared any longer. Jed stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, the rising sun warming his bruised and bloodied face. The other ranchers, the men he had led, clapped him on the back, their faces filled with gratitude and a newfound, profound respect. The door of the cabin opened, and Sarah ran out, straight into his arms. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, the reality of their survival washing over him in a powerful, dizzying wave. She was safe. Hope was safe. They were safe. A few weeks later, a gentle peace settled over Stone's Throw. The scars of the battle were fading. The barn was being rebuilt, with the help of the neighboring ranchers. The town of Redemption, its tyrant overthrown, had changed its tune. Jed and Sarah were no longer objects of scandal and gossip, but heroes. They were greeted with nods of respect, their credit was good at the general store, and Reverend Michael even stopped by to offer a sincere blessing for their family. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Jed stood on his porch. Creek was whittling a piece of wood, a contented look on his grizzled face. A few feet away, Hope was gurgling happily on a blanket, batting at a sunbeam with her tiny fists. Sarah came out of the cabin and stood beside Jed, her hand finding his and lacing her fingers through his. The touch was no longer awkward or hesitant. It was natural, familiar, filled with an unspoken depth of love and partnership that had been forged in fire and fear. He had married her to protect his ranch. He had fought for her to protect his life. But somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with her. He wasn't just her rescuer. She was his. She and Hope had filled the desolate silence of his life with a beautiful, chaotic music. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her smile, then down at the baby, their baby. He looked out at the land, his land, stretching out before them under a sky painted in breathtaking shades of purple and gold. "I thought I was just building a ranch," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that caught in his throat. "All those lonely years, I was just putting up fences and raising cattle." He squeezed her hand. "But we built a home." Sarah smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her intelligent eyes. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a perfect fit. "We did," she said softly. They stood together, a small family bathed in the warm, golden light of the setting sun. Their pasts were filled with pain and loss. Their beginning was a lie born of desperation, but their future, once as uncertain as a prairie storm, was now as wide and promising as the Montana sky.